In the dim gray light of the early morning on January 20th, 1953, the peaceful ritual of America's democratic transfer of power was about to be shattered by a moment so quiet, so deceptively simple, yet so cutting that it would echo through decades of political memory. At 8:45 a.m., President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower sat stiffly in the backseat of a gleaming black limousine parked before the north portico of the White House. The air was cold, but not bitter, hovering at 49 degrees under an overcast sky that pressed low over Washington, as if mirroring the tension coiling unseen between the two most powerful men in the country. Eisenhower did not step out. He did not approach the doors. He did not follow the tradition that every president-elect before him had observed. Instead, he remained perfectly still inside the car, jaw tight, gaze forward, issuing a silent message that struck with more force than words. He would not enter Harry S. Truman's White House. Inside the building, Truman stood by a tall window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the stationary limousine that refused to move. The outgoing president knew precisely what was happening. Eisenhower had been clear. He was rejecting the offer of hospitality, declining the customary coffee with the Trumans, and most importantly, refusing to cross the threshold as a guest. This was no misunderstanding of schedules, no polite mix-up. It was a calculated deviation from the traditions that symbolized unity, continuity, and respect in American democracy. And the man delivering this silent rebuke was no ordinary politician. Eisenhower was 62 years old, the supreme Allied commander of World War II, the strategist who had accepted Nazi Germany's surrender and commanded millions across continents, a liberator, a hero, a symbol of American victory. The nation had chosen him resoundingly, 55% of the popular vote, 442 electoral votes, an overwhelming affirmation of trust. Yet here he was, refusing to walk 20 feet to greet the man who had once given him everything: authority, responsibility, opportunity, and national stature. That man, Harry S. Truman, age 68, waited inside. A farmer, haberdasher, senator, vice president, and president. A man who had faced the unimaginable decisions of atomic warfare, who had confronted Stalin, rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, integrated the armed forces, and fired Douglas MacArthur in a storm of controversy. He had once offered Eisenhower the presidency itself, lowering himself to vice president if Eisenhower wished it. And now, after years of rising tension, disappointment, and political betrayal, Truman stood in the White House watching the hero he had elevated refuse even the simplest gesture of respect. It was a moment frozen in time, two men bound by history, separated by pride, standing at the brink of one of the coldest transitions in American political life, a fracture silently exposed to the nation before the ceremony had even begun.
What unfolded between Truman and Eisenhower on that January morning did not erupt suddenly. It was not the product of one argument, one insult, or one moment of political heat. Instead, it was the consequence of years, slow, grinding years of shifting loyalties, wounded pride, political storms, and decisions that each man believed revealed the other's true character. Their fracture had begun quietly, almost invisibly, at a time when they were still allies, still bound by the aftermath of the greatest war in human history. Back in July 1945, when Truman was newly thrust into the presidency after Roosevelt's death, he had stood beside Eisenhower in the bombed ruins of Berlin. The devastation stretched endlessly: collapsed facades, twisted steel, scorched stone. To Truman, the world felt perilous, uncertain. In Eisenhower, he saw steadiness, vision, and a kind of moral authority that only victory could bestow. As they rode together through the wreckage, Truman turned to him and promised something extraordinary. "There is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get." He meant the presidency. He meant stepping aside. He meant reshaping American politics if that was what Eisenhower desired. This moment of generosity, offered without cameras, without witnesses, without political calculus, planted the seed of trust between them. Eisenhower declined, insisting he was not a politician, and Truman believed him. For years afterward, the two men worked in cautious harmony. Truman appointed Eisenhower Army Chief of Staff, awarded him 3 Distinguished Service Medals, and ultimately entrusted him with the supreme command of NATO. They wrote courteous letters, they shared ceremonies without warmth but with respect. Their relationship was never intimate, but it was stable, professional, loyal, mutually beneficial. And then came the second offer. The secret offer, the offer Truman wrote into his private diary on July 25, 1947. He was terrified that Douglas MacArthur, ambitious, autocratic, dangerous in Truman's eyes, might return from Japan and run for president. To stop him, Truman proposed an unthinkable political gamble. Eisenhower would run as the Democratic nominee, Truman would step down, and together they would win. "I like the Senate anyway," Truman wrote wistfully in his diary. I could be elected, and my family would be happy outside this great white jail." Again, Eisenhower refused. Again, Truman accepted the refusal as sincere. He believed Eisenhower simply did not want power. But the world changed in 1952. That was the year Eisenhower reversed everything he had ever said about politics. After years of insisting he had no political ambition, he announced he would run for president, but not as a Democrat, not with Truman, not with the man who had offered him everything. He ran as a Republican against Truman's party, Truman's legacy, and Truman himself. The sense of betrayal that washed over Truman was profound and unforgettable. To him, it felt personal, humiliating, and deeply unfair. Eisenhower had turned down the presidency twice, only to seize it when it benefited him politically. And yet, this was still not the fatal break. The true breach, the wound that could not heal, came later, during the brutal storms of the campaign trail. But by the time those storms hit, the foundation between the two men had already begun to crack.
The campaign of 1952 did not merely strain the relationship between Truman and Eisenhower, it shattered it. What had begun as quiet disappointment and wounded pride soon transformed into something far harsher, something closer to contempt, because at the center of the conflict stood a single man whose name carried enormous weight in both their lives. General George C. Marshall. Marshall was not just another statesman. He was the architect of Allied victory in World War II, the builder of the modern American Army, the strategist whose European recovery program, known forever as the Marshall Plan, rescued a shattered continent from hunger, chaos, and communist influence. He was the only career military officer in history to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And more importantly for this story, he was the man who saw Dwight Eisenhower's brilliance before anyone else did. Without Marshall, there would have been no Eisenhower of North Africa, no Eisenhower of D-Day, no Eisenhower on the world stage. Marshall had promoted him over hundreds of senior officers, guided him, protected him, and ultimately trusted him with the most important invasion in modern history. Eisenhower owed Marshall everything. Truman revered Marshall as deeply as Eisenhower did. Truman believed Marshall embodied integrity, honor, and duty. He called him the greatest living American. So when Senator Joseph McCarthy, a man fueled by reckless fear-mongering, began launching deranged accusations that Marshall was a communist conspirator, both Truman and many in Washington expected Eisenhower to defend the man who had built his career. It seemed a certainty, a moral obligation, and at first it looked like Eisenhower would. His team drafted a speech for Milwaukee, McCarthy's own political stronghold, containing a clear, powerful paragraph defending Marshall's loyalty and character. Reporters saw the draft. They anticipated a historic moment, Eisenhower standing beside McCarthy, publicly rebuking him, choosing integrity over politics. But political advisors warned Eisenhower against it. Wisconsin was crucial. McCarthy was popular. The Republican Party wanted unity, not confrontation. And so Eisenhower made a choice that history would never forget. He deleted the paragraph. On October 3, 1952, standing in Milwaukee Arena before 10,000 cheering supporters, with McCarthy smiling beside him, Eisenhower delivered a speech stripped of any defense of George Marshall. He did not speak the mentor's name. He did not acknowledge the slander. He did not challenge the lies. And then came the photograph. McCarthy seizing Eisenhower's hand, thrusting it triumphantly into the air. A war hero raised beside a man who had called his mentor a traitor. The image spread across the country like wildfire. Reporters immediately realized Eisenhower had removed the Marshall paragraph. Newspapers condemned it. Commentators dissected it. Even Republicans whispered their disapproval. Truman, furious beyond measure, declared, "I never thought the man would stoop so low." And that was only Milwaukee. Days earlier in Indianapolis, Eisenhower had stood smiling beside Senator William Jenner, who had called Marshall a front man for traitors. To Truman, this was unforgivable. Eisenhower hadn't merely stayed silent. He had aligned himself publicly with the very men who tried to destroy Marshall's reputation. What Truman saw was simple. Eisenhower had chosen political victory over loyalty, ambition over integrity, power over honor. And from that moment onward, the relationship between the two men was broken beyond repair.
By the time Election Day approached in 1952, the bitterness between Truman and Eisenhower had grown into something vast and unbridgeable, a canyon carved not only by political rivalry, but by a sense of moral betrayal that neither man could disguise. Truman believed deeply in loyalty. To him, loyalty was not a strategic choice nor a temporary alliance. It was a measure of a man's character. And Eisenhower, in Truman's eyes, had failed that measure in the most public and humiliating way possible. Yet what hardened Truman's heart even further was the escalating campaign rhetoric. Eisenhower had pledged to go to Korea, implying he could end the war more decisively than Truman had. Republican surrogates accused Truman's administration of corruption, incompetence, and weakness in the face of communism. Every attack sharpened Truman's sense that the war hero he once admired had transformed into a politician willing to wound anyone to win. And Eisenhower, for his part, was growing angrier too. He read Truman's speeches. He saw the headlines. He believed Truman was weaponizing Marshall's honor for political gain. He believed Truman was calling him a coward, not out of principle, but out of fury that Eisenhower had chosen a different political path. And perhaps most painfully, Eisenhower convinced himself that Truman did not truly care about Marshall, that the outrage was a political maneuver rather than a defense of a mentor's legacy. The truth, of course, was far more complex. Truman had served with Marshall at the highest levels of government. He trusted Marshall's judgment, relied on him through crises, and recognized his integrity. When Truman defended Marshall, it was not a tactic, it was personal. To attack Marshall was to attack Truman's presidency, his administration, and his own belief in decency. And when Eisenhower failed to defend Marshall, that failure cut deeply. The campaign spiraled further. Truman, speaking bluntly as always, called Eisenhower a stooge of Wall Street, a puppet of reactionaries, and, most pointedly, a man lacking the courage to stand up to extremists within his own party. Eisenhower's resentment festered. He saw Truman's words as slander, deeply unfair and twisted by partisanship. And so, when the election finally arrived, the personal wounds were already beyond healing. Eisenhower won in a sweeping landslide, 55% of the popular vote and 442 electoral votes. The public embraced him not only as a leader, but as a symbol of strength, stability, and military honor. Truman prepared to leave, but beneath the rituals of transition, a storm of bitterness continued to churn. On November 18th, the two men sat together in the Oval Office for the customary briefing. Both dreaded the meeting. Truman he truly tried to pass on the wisdom of the presidency, the structure of the White House, the flow of information, the delicate machinery of policymaking. Eisenhower listened, but his impatience was obvious. Truman saw it. Eisenhower's expression was stiff, curt, dismissive. He seemed to believe he already understood more than Truman could possibly teach him. And when they turned to foreign affairs, domestic budgeting, and national security, the distance widened. Truman believed Eisenhower was arrogant, unwilling to learn. Eisenhower believed Truman was lecturing him, defensive, partisan, and condescending. Both left the meeting convinced the other was in the wrong. Both carried their grievances forward. And as Inauguration Day approached, resentment crystallized into a decision that would become one of the most uncomfortable moments in the history of American transitions. Eisenhower would refuse to enter the White House.
Inauguration morning arrived with a quiet, heavy tension that seemed to cling to every surface of Washington. The Capitol was draped in flags, the streets filled with crowds eager to witness the peaceful transfer of power. But inside the White House, there was nothing peaceful at all. The air itself felt brittle, strained by the unresolved bitterness between Truman and Eisenhower. The outgoing president woke early, aware that tradition demanded a final symbolic gesture. The president-elect would enter the White House, share a brief cordial moment, then escort him to the car for their ride to the Capitol. Every previous transition had followed this ritual. It was a gesture of respect, a reminder that in America, power does not belong to men, but to institutions. But Eisenhower had made up his mind days earlier. He would not step inside Truman's White House. Advisors had sensed the tension, but none guessed that Eisenhower would break one of the most fundamental traditions of the presidency. For him, this was not about protocol. It was not about symbolism. It was about pride, wounded pride, simmering anger, and the belief that Truman had dishonored him during the campaign. And so, at 8:45 a.m., the limousine rolled to a stop under the north portico. Eisenhower remained inside, rigid and unspeaking. Mamie Eisenhower sat beside him, aware of the weight of his silence. She did not try to persuade him otherwise. She knew this decision was fixed. Inside, Truman watched the car through the tall window. He knew instantly what Eisenhower was doing. There was no confusion, no waiting for an explanation. Truman had hoped, just faintly, that perhaps tradition might soften Eisenhower's heart. But the sight of the motionless car told him the truth. The incoming president would not walk through the door. For a moment, Truman hesitated. The breach of protocol was more than disrespect. It was a deliberate public humiliation. And yet, Truman understood something deeper than personal pride. The presidency was larger than either man. So he squared his shoulders, stepped out into the cold morning air, and walked toward the limousine. The cameras flashed instantly, capturing the painful image for history. Truman, the sitting president of the United States, walking alone to the car because his successor refused to enter the White House. Truman opened the car door and climbed inside. Eisenhower did not extend a hand, he did not offer a greeting, he simply nodded stiffly, his gaze forward. The silence was suffocating. The two men sat inches apart, yet worlds away from each other. Mamie Eisenhower attempted small talk, weather, the size of the crowds, the excitement in the city, but her voice sounded fragile, strained. Neither man responded. As the car rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue, Eisenhower finally broke the silence, but not with courtesy. He asked sharply who had authorized his son John's return from Korea. The question carried suspicion, tension, and an undercurrent of accusation. Truman did not hesitate. "I did," he answered quietly. Then he explained that he believed a son should witness his father swearing in as president. It was an act of kindness, not politics, an act of decency amid bitterness. Eisenhower said nothing. No thanks, no acknowledgement. He simply turned back to the window. And so the car continued, carrying two men bound by history, yet divided by pride, toward a ceremony meant to symbolize unity, but shadowed instead by the deepest rift between any two presidents in modern American memory.
When the car finally reached the Capitol, the suffocating silence between the two men broke only because protocol required movement. Truman stepped out first, maintaining the dignity of his office even as he carried the weight of one of the most awkward presidential transitions in American history. Eisenhower followed, jaw tense, eyes fixed ahead, refusing even a passing glance at the man he was replacing. The inauguration ceremony itself unfolded smoothly on the surface, flags waving, bands performing, dignitaries gathered in their finest attire. Yet for those who had witnessed the icy tension from the White House to the Capitol, the pageantry felt almost surreal. Two men who had once admired each other, who had worked together through the most turbulent years of the 20th century, now stood only feet apart, but with a chasm of hurt pride between them. When Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office, Eisenhower raised his hand with the steadiness of a military commander accustomed to solemn moments. His speech spoke of unity, duty, and America's responsibility to lead the free world. Not once did he acknowledge Truman. Not once did he gesture to the man who had been president for nearly 8 critical years. Truman sat nearby, stoic, absorbing each word with the calm resolve of a man who had weathered storms far harsher than political contempt. The moment the ceremony ended, Truman quietly prepared to leave. He did not join Eisenhower for the parade, nor linger for polite conversation. Instead, he made his way to Union Station, where more than 5,000 supporters had gathered to welcome him home. As he appeared, the crowd erupted, cheering, waving, shouting his name with a fervor that stunned even those who knew his popularity in the Midwest. Photographs from that moment showed Truman smiling broadly, visibly moved, as police formed a flying wedge to escort him through the dense crowd. After nearly 8 years in the White House, Truman was leaving not in triumph, but in dignity. He returned to Independence, Missouri, where he would spend the remainder of his life walking to the library he built, taking morning strolls, and writing his memoirs. Eisenhower, meanwhile, settled into the Oval Office and began shaping the country according to his vision. Yet he made one decision that revealed how deep the rift truly was. He never invited Truman back to the White House, not for dinners, not for celebrations, not for historic events. For 8 long years, Truman never set foot inside the building he once occupied. Eisenhower sent 3 invitations, carefully timed, carefully worded, but Truman rejected them all. As intended, he wrote bluntly after one. Truman felt the gestures were insincere, mere performances, attempts to make the world believe a reconciliation had occurred. Eisenhower, in turn, believed Truman was being unnecessarily hostile, unable to let go of old grievances. And so the frozen hostility continued, shaping the atmosphere of 2 former presidents who carried scars from the same war, the same era, the same nation they had served, but who could no longer speak without reopening old wounds. For years they remained locked in silence, their once promising alliance buried under anger and pride. But history, in its strange symmetry, was not finished with them yet. Life would force these 2 men, who had refused to even speak on a cold January morning, back into the same room again.
For nearly 7 years after that bitter inauguration morning, Truman and Eisenhower lived in a state of suspended hostility, neither willing to speak, neither willing to forgive, both convinced the other had committed an unforgivable personal betrayal. And perhaps, in their own ways, both were right. Yet time, relentless in its quiet erosion of pride, began shaping events neither man could avoid. The first moment of forced proximity came with the death of George Marshall in October 1959.
the man whose legacy had driven such a deep wedge between them. Marshall, the organizer of victory, the architect of the post-war order, and the mentor who had shaped Eisenhower's career, passed away at Walter Reed Hospital at the age of 78. His funeral was held at the Fort Myer Chapel in Virginia. It was impossible for either Truman or Eisenhower to stay away. They both owed Marshall too much. And so for the first time since January 20th, 1953, the two former presidents found themselves sitting side by side in the same pew. They did not speak. They did not even exchange a glance. Photographs of the funeral captured them in silent grief, each lost in his own memories of the man who had meant so much. Marshall had once been the bridge between them. Now, in death, he became the solemn force pushing them back into the same space, if not yet into reconciliation. Over the next few years, death would bring them together again. Chief Justice Fred Vinson died, then Speaker Sam Rayburn, then Eleanor Roosevelt. At each funeral, Truman and Eisenhower appeared in the same room, exchanged brief acknowledgments, nods that were polite but cold, fleeting gestures that spoke not of forgiveness but of obligation. They were civil but distant, two old warriors standing on opposite sides of a chasm carved by politics and pride. But history had one final convergence planned. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation was shaken to its core. For the funeral, former presidents were called to Washington. Truman and Eisenhower arrived with the weight of collective national grief pressing down upon them. Kennedy's casket lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands filed past, mourning a leader who had been cut down in his prime. And for the first time since Marshall's funeral, Truman and Eisenhower looked directly at each other, not with bitterness, but with a shared understanding of the responsibilities and sorrows of the office they had both carried. On the ride to Arlington National Cemetery, the two men were seated together in the same car, accompanied by Mamie Eisenhower and Margaret Truman, and something remarkable happened. They talked. Not stiff pleasantries, not forced conversation, real, honest, thoughtful dialogue about the assassination, about whether it was the act of a lone gunman or a conspiracy, about the world's dangers, about the burdens of leadership. Margaret Truman later wrote that it was the first time in years she had heard her father speak to Eisenhower without sharpness. After the graveside service, she invited the Eisenhowers to join them at Blair House for lunch. They accepted. For over an hour, Eisenhower and Truman sat together, reminiscing about old battles, political and otherwise, speaking like men who had finally remembered they once admired each other. A White House aide later said, "You'd think there had never been any differences between them. It was really wonderful." And when the Eisenhowers finally prepared to leave, the two former presidents stepped onto the sidewalk together and shook hands. A long, lingering handshake. A handshake that carried 10 years of bitterness, silence, pride, and regret. And at last, the beginning of forgiveness. Their handshake outside Blair House in 1963 did not erase a decade of resentment, nor did it magically restore the warmth they might have once shared. But it marked something important, an acknowledgement that time, loss, and the shared weight of history had softened edges that once felt too sharp to touch. After that day, Truman and Eisenhower were no longer enemies trapped in silence. They were two aging statesmen who had lived long enough to understand that pride, however justified, was never worth the years it devoured. They met once more in 1966 at a United Nations luncheon in Kansas City. Eisenhower's brother, Milton, sat with them and later remarked that all the old animosities were forgotten. For one afternoon, the bitterness that had defined their relationship seemed to dissolve, replaced by easy conversation and a quiet, almost affectionate recognition of the paths they had walked. It was not friendship in the youthful sense, but something wiser, something earned. But time did not pause for reconciliation. Dwight Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78.
He had served 2 full terms as president, ending the Korean War, containing Soviet influence, building the interstate highway system, and reshaping America's global posture. His presidency, steady and measured, had left a legacy of lasting impact. Truman attended the funeral with genuine respect, not as a wounded rival, but as a fellow servant of the nation who understood the burdens Eisenhower had carried. Truman himself lived 3 more years. He died on December 26, 1972, in Independence, Missouri. He spent his final decades writing, reflecting, and walking the familiar streets of his hometown. Visitors often found him thoughtful, candid, still fiery in his opinions, but the rage he had once felt toward Eisenhower had long since settled into something gentler. History, however, never forgot what happened on January 20th, 1953. Eisenhower's refusal to enter the White House became one of the most striking images of the American presidency, an image that revealed how deeply personal grievances can seep into the rituals of public duty. It was photographed, analyzed, retold in books and documentaries, passed down as an example of how pride can distort even the most sacred traditions of democratic transfer. To Eisenhower, the refusal was a response to what he believed were personal attacks during the campaign, a rejection of Truman's accusations and bitterness. To Truman, it was an act of disrespect, a refusal to defend Marshall, a betrayal of loyalty, a wound delivered on the most public stage imaginable. Both men had reasons. Both men felt wronged, and both allowed their anger to overshadow the ceremony meant to symbolize unity. Yet, history also remembers what happened a decade later. 2 old men sitting together at Blair House, remembering the past not with venom, but with clarity. Their eventual reconciliation, however quiet, offers something the inauguration incident never could, a reminder that even the deepest fractures can, with time, be mended. In the end, the story of Truman and Eisenhower is not merely about politics or power. It is about character, loyalty, pride, regret, and the fragile humanity behind the institutions that shape nations. It shows how easily personal wounds can overshadow public duty and how sometimes the simplest gestures of understanding can heal what once seemed irreparable. 2 presidents, 2 men, 2 lives bound by war, peace, rivalry, and history. And one cold January morning that history will never forget.